But when NIST released their report in August, they gave a different measurement. They gave the height of the top of the parapet, is the way they phrased it. There was a little wall right up the roof line that to keep people from falling off the roof, okay? So from the top of that, the visible roof line, down to the top of the windows of the 29th floor is what they labeled. And they gave the height of each of those 2 points to the nearest inch. So it's like very precise measurement. So bingo, I could calibrate my measurement. And once I did that, I got 9.88 meters per second squared is the unit. But it's 9.802 is the actual acceleration of gravity in New York City. You can look that up in Wikipedia. So it actually looks as though it's just barely over free fall, but it's within 1%, and it's not reliable to that regard. So basically, it's as close as you can get to being right smack on free fall acceleration. And so anyway, that was what I came out with. And so for them to be claiming 40% slower than free fall, it was just totally a bull-faced lie.
Like anybody, if they could go and learn how to use this program, they could measure for themselves, and they will come out with the same data that you did.
Yep.
So NIST, obviously, like you said, they would obviously intentionally have to be misleading on this data because they would have came up with the same you did.
That's right. I use open source, free download stuff, and I'll have links to it right on my website. So anybody wants to go do the measurement, they can do it for themselves. But, yeah, I mean, NIST clearly had the expertise to do this measurement correctly. But what NIST was doing was even more bizarre than that, because what they were talking about was not the acceleration of the building. They were talking about the time for fall, as though there's a starting point and an ending point for it to cover this interval. It's just like using a stopwatch, or it's like using 2 data points, like a starting point and an ending point, and ignoring everything in between. And the formula they used, they actually said they were assuming constant speed, which is total baloney. I mean, that was obviously an error. What they were using was an assumption that it was a constant acceleration. And so they were using a bad assumption, because no matter what kind of rationale they have for when they started their stopwatch, to make the assertion through the equations they used that it's constant acceleration from their starting point to the ending point is completely false. Basically, they took an early start time, so it's like you start the stopwatch and then the building just sits there for almost a couple of seconds, and then it just falls, and then they stop the stopwatch. And so they're mixing a period where it was not falling with a period where it was falling. And so, of course, they can make the time, they can stretch it out to whatever they want, because they didn't actually hit any legitimate starting time. Any kind of quibbling over was something happening at the point they started their clock is totally erroneous. I mean, it has nothing to do with the motion of the building. The motion was not a uniform motion. So the only valid way to measure it would be to take lots of little measurements along the way, like I was doing with measuring the frames. And so if they actually go frame by frame, they would see that there was a period where basically the graph is level, and then a period where the graph would be falling. And then at the period where it's falling, you just take the slope of that, and that gives you the acceleration. If you're graphing velocity versus time for anybody who's into this sort of thing. So that's the deal. It was a bull-faced lie. And what happened was, by the fact that I was on the architects and engineers mailing list, when somebody posted this information that there was going to be this, they were going to have a technical briefing conference. And at first I said, oh boy, let's get on board and let's ask him some hard questions. Mm-hmm. Well, then it turns out in order to qualify to get on the list, you had to have some kind of institutional affiliation, like be with some university or some corporation or something like that. I'm a high school teacher. So I figured, well, that leaves me out. But then just at the last minute, I mean, pretty much at the end of when you could apply, I thought, well, it couldn't hurt. So I went ahead and applied anyway. and I just put down American Association of Physics Teachers, which was my professional affiliation. I mean, that's the high school physics teachers group. It's high school and junior college and introductory college level physics teachers. And I figured, well, maybe they'll accept that. And they did. I was just waiting around. I never got any notice back from them. But on the morning when they had the conference, 5 minutes before the conference began, and I was literally getting ready to go to school, I got a password sent to me on my email. So I checked my email, and there it was. So I just logged in and tossed off a question and went to school. Mm-hmm. And that was the turning point in a lot of activity around this because, I mean, I just asked such a simple question. I just said, basically, hey, anybody can tell that it's a free fall. How can you get away with saying it's 40% slower than free fall? I didn't put it in quite those words. I said something about, that was such a publicly visible, easily measurable quantity, and how could they set that aside? Okay?
Right.
I didn't see the result of that conference or even hear about the result of that conference. I didn't even know my question got asked for a couple of weeks. When I finally did see it, it was like, whoa. I mean, Shyam Sundar, who's the director of the NIST investigation, was the one who answered that, and he just went around in circles for a couple minutes, and then he finally basically, if you listen carefully to what he says, when he finally settles down to actually saying it, he's saying it couldn't have been free fall because free fall is what you get when there's no support. There's no structural support. And there was structural support. And it took time to clear it all out. It didn't all happen at once. And so basically it didn't happen. It couldn't happen that way, so it didn't happen that way. That's his reasoning. That's exactly what he's saying.
Right.
And he says it sort of in sort of a mangled sort of a way, so it's really hard to figure it all out, but that's what he's saying. And so he's basically sweeping aside the observational evidence in favor of what their model predicted. They did all this stuff on computer modeling to try to say how the building would have fallen. Their model predicted that it ought to take 5.4 seconds to come down for that 18 floors or whatever. And they were taking that, they're giving priority to what it should have happened according to their model over what the observed facts were.
First of all, the fact that they admitted the 2.5 second free fall time, as far as I understand it, in a natural collapse, you cannot have free fall for any time.
That's right.
So therefore, there had to be a mechanism to enable this free fall to happen.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, they didn't admit that right away or anything. They came out in November with their final report, and in their final report, they changed the whole analysis around.
Right. Now, that's what I wanted to ask you about. Was somebody at NIST, when they put out the retraction or the amendment or something like that, it was very significant with what they said?
Well, they didn't retract anything. They are obscuring everything all over again in a different way, is what's happening.
Oh.
And what they did was they're basically claiming their original measurement is still valid. They're still holding on to that. But then what they did, because they did a measurement similar to mine, where they actually took a video and decomposed it frame by frame and came up with a little graph similar to mine. And they admitted that there was this period of free fall. But what they did was they couched that into an overall time that they called this overall time of collapse of 5.4 seconds. So they held on to the 5.4 seconds, which was the number their model predicted. And they're just now saying that the free fall was just a part of that time. As though that had any, it's just throwing words around. They said 2.25 seconds, but still, it's not significantly different. So there are 2.25 seconds that they claim for free fall. They give no rationale for how that could happen. They give no physical process that could allow for that. They simply say this was part of a longer process that they start earlier. There's a lot of other things about their description that are bogus as well. They're claiming, first of all, that a single column gave way, column 79, and that gave way because fire expanded a horizontal member that pushed a different horizontal member off of its seat, leaving a length of column 79 unsupported, and then it buckled because of this long, like a piece of spaghetti, right? You push on it, and they're claiming it buckled that way. It's not plausible if you actually look at it in detail, but that's what they're claiming happened. They had to have some way of trying to tie all this to fire. And so you had a single column with the buckling and the column failure, and that was underneath what's the east penthouse. So if you look at the videos, it looks like two penthouses, one on the east side or the left side. All the videos are basically shot from the north looking south, okay?
Right.
So on the left, that penthouse collapses first, and there's several seconds where hardly anything's happening. And then the other penthouse starts to collapse, and when it's only partway collapsed, the whole building just gives way and starts down at free fall. So that's essentially the sequence of events, all right?
Mm-hmm.
The whole business there, they're claiming that the single column was what happened. It turns out that actually you'd have to have 2 or 3 columns collapse in order for the penthouse to cave in. And so 79 and 80 and so forth, there's several columns that were underneath that east penthouse. And yeah, that went first, so probably 79 was involved. But they're claiming that there was a progressive failure internal in the building that's not visible from the outside.
Right.
And that this progressed across the building. And so they're basically saying the whole building sort of gutted itself internally, and then all we're seeing, what appears to be this free fall, is just a shell, as though at that point it's just a hollow shell.
Oh, so they're saying the whole guts of the building's already gone inside.
Yeah.
Something that we can't observe, and neither can they, but that must have been what happened.
That's right. They're big on invoking things that are not visible, because that way they don't have to actually deal with evidence, right?
Right.
Well, in any case, there's a number of points about their argument, their scenario, that don't make any sense at all. Number one is you can see the west penthouse. In other words, the other structure, which actually is not a penthouse, it turns out. If you look at aerial photographs from beforehand, the other is like air conditioning units that are sitting, the whole line of air conditioning units on the top of the building there. But it looks sort of like a penthouse, and it's been called the west penthouse, okay? So anyway, this structure on top of the building, it's supported right up to the bitter end. And if it's being supported, that means the columns under it are intact right up until the very end. And it gives way a fraction of a second ahead of the general collapse of the building. In other words, it doesn't even fall far enough to become hidden by the building by the time the whole building goes. So it just barely has a bare head start, and then boom, the whole building cuts loose and drops. Okay? So the columns had to have been there right up to that point. And there's another thing. When the building came crushing down, there was this huge billowing that's been described and likened to pyroclastic clouds, all right? And there's been debate back and forth on some of the characteristics of pyroclastic flow and stuff like that, like volcanic eruptions and everything. But all these clouds of debris that went racing down the street, okay?
Yeah.
When did those start? They started with the visible collapse. If the entire building had collapsed internally ahead of time, that would have started ahead of time. I mean, you're seeing the mass of the building in pulverized form racing down the street. And it did not get a head start on this visible collapse. And so the visible collapse is the real collapse. When the wall that we saw coming down came down, it was the whole building coming down at that point.
Well, one of the arguments I know the debunkers like to use is they say that we don't start the timing at the initiation of collapse of the penthouse when we should be starting from there, and then we know that.
They didn't either. If they had done that, it would have been a lot more than 5.4 seconds.
Okay, so NIST wasn't doing it either.
All right, the east penthouse fell, and then there's a pause when not much is happening, and then the corner of the west penthouse starts to go a little ahead of everything else, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So between the time when the east penthouse fell and when the west penthouse started to show a little bit of motion, in between there, when there's really nothing happening, that's when they start their clock.